Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. This is our first Monday, isn't it? I gotta click on got it. Sorry. I got the mouse in my hands here. There you go. All right, just a couple announcements, and we just had a couple decided on as we spoke. So Val's going to give her announcement. Go ahead, Val.
Oh,
I'll let you
okay.
go first.
So I have a presentation, a holiday presentation on Monday, holiday lights presentation on Monday, December 4th. And the gang thought it would be a good idea if we followed that up with an actual hands-on workshop, photo walk, whatever you want to call it. So I suggested the Christmas Village. I have nothing against Grings Mill, but I don't think
Not
it's
enough
as
lights.
much. So there's a ton of fun things that you can photograph and play around with at the Christmas Village. So I was thinking that we could do that on Thursday, December 7th, and I would like to be there at open because otherwise it gets hairy.
Okay.
And
all the details are to come, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what time does it open?
Hang on, I'm double checking that.
Oh, okay.
It changes on Thanksgiving. Like it's just weekends now. It's open now as of this weekend. But then it switches. I'll have to go online because it still just has the current hours.
Yeah, and that'll be in the next newsletter and announcements, and you can post it on the Facebook page too, Val, once you have all the
Okay.
details. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. That should be fun. And I'm going to let Jeff make the next announcement about our sharing slideshow.
Yeah, so for the annual end of the year meeting, we'll do a slideshow again, like we've done the last few years. So what we do is everybody submits 10 photos and a photo of themselves, and then I'll put it together in a slideshow, set the music, and we can all see what you were up to this year. So they don't have to be prize-winning photos, just photos that meant something and sort of showed something about your journey this year. So information will be in the next newsletter. And the only thing I ask is read the instructions carefully and please follow them. It makes my life a whole lot easier if I don't have to go back and forth with folks. And if you just name them the way I put it in there, including a 0 when it's 0, 1, 0, 2, it sorts really nice for me. And include a picture of yourself so I don't have to go back and forth and say, where's your photo? So that would be great if you can just submit all of them. We'll have a link of where you upload to. So we'll get that together for the meeting in December.
And all those details will be in the next newsletter too.
Yeah.
Okay. And I promise this year that we're going to take time to run the slideshow properly instead of rushing through it at the very end. We ran too much business last year, and I want to make it more sociable this year. So that's always the highlight of that meeting. Since Jeff, you've been doing that, and I want to make that more of a highlight of this year than it was last year. So thanks, Jeff, for putting that together, because I know it's a ton of work gathering all that up, and he does a really nice job. So I can't wait to see everyone's year's journey for 2023. That's always a fun thing to share. It's non-competition. So that's my next announcement. Okay. Those of you that were here last week, we had I'll say a brutal judging session. But I started last week's meeting, and I was told that I bullied the membership. So I want to apologize for my statement at the beginning of last week. If you don't remember, I said I was ticked off because nobody's participating, blah, blah, blah. What I meant to say was, if you're not sending anything in for our club competition, we do have the PSA competition, and we're asked to send 6 images in 3 different categories 3 times a year. Okay, so if you don't want to be critiqued during the the club competition or critiques, you still have the opportunity to share an image with us so that we can send that up to the PSA. And that's a national competition, and competition was a dirty word last week. And whenever I said, I'm upset because nobody's participating, you have to bring it in, I guess I did come across as a bully, and I apologize. But what I wanted to say was, you have the opportunity to share your images with us and the PSA, and we can use those as our representation for a Berks photographic. We have 3 categories, if you don't already know. One that we added this year, so we have 6 more images that we need, is monochrome. So last year we couldn't submit any black and whites, and we had a lot of really good black and white monochrome entries last year, and we couldn't submit them because they wouldn't accept them because we weren't part of the monochrome division. So we signed up for monochrome this year. So people like Dutch and Vince and a lot of people who do a lot of black and white, you have the opportunity to send your images up this year. So we have 3 rounds, 3 divisions: nature division, open color, pictorial division, and now the monochrome. It's open, so there's no rules of what subjects you need to have. So contact me or Vince or part of the competition committee if you're willing and excited, not being forced or bullied into it, if you would like to compete at the national level. And I suggest you go into the PSA and take a look at what other clubs are doing, what other clubs are submitting, and get an idea of what kind of images are being submitted. Okay, so that's my apology, tongue in cheek. But if I did come across too strong, I do actually apologize for it. Okay, and remember, we have the Santa shoot coming up on, I keep forgetting, December 16th, right? 11 to 3. Okay, so contact Kim or the Santa crew if you're willing to put in some time on December 16th, right? The other thing is, and Jeff already mentioned that about the sharing slideshow. So we will have our membership meeting in December. It's in the newsletter, and that's when we're going to elect, nominate officers again. So we will be asking you to step forward. If we're going to need a president, a vice president, treasurer, secretary, the whole bit. Now we have a lot of people who say they'll do 2024. But if you're willing to be on the board or serve on a committee, please step forward, because we hate to ask. And we have had a number of people step forward, so we have had a lot of volunteers this year, right? So that's my plea. Please, please, please step forward so that we can keep this organization running smoothly, right? All right, I'm going to hand it over to Jay. You still there?
I'm here.
And Steve. And I'm going to mute myself unless we have questions.
All right, everybody. I'm going to start out with a little short presentation before I introduce our wonderful guest. So can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, here we go. So I'm going to share with you about gas. Can everybody see this?
Yep.
Okay. So gas is gear acquisition syndrome. And I thought this would be a fun, short little presentation on some strategies and helpful hints. And Steve may touch on this a little bit himself. So what is gas? It's an intense level of psychosis brought on for a desire for more photographic gear. Symptoms, if you experience this, you might understand this. Loss of sleep. All you're doing is thinking about buying gear. A dramatic reduction in your bank account. Possibly a sense of guilt for not letting a significant other know about the purchase. And cures. A good idea is to wait 24 to 48 hours. It may relieve some of the psychoses and bring the photographer back to some reality. Purchasing the equipment does help, but it only provides temporary relief. And an unbiased camera equipment evaluation by a camera expert like Steve is very helpful. Another thing that helps cure this is communicating with your significant other to greatly diminish gear acquisition syndrome. All right, here's some more strategies for battling gas. What are your needs? Assess your true needs, not what your camera manufacturers or YouTube tells you. Have you reached the limitations of your current gear? I ask myself that when I'm thinking about it. Be honest, why do you need it for your photography? And again, ask an unbiased camera expert their opinion in person at a local camera store. More strategies. What's missing? What do you feel is currently missing in your current gear? What new features would be helpful? Are there any workarounds which you can accomplish what you're looking for? For example, using the high-res mode, stitching images together, or definitely improving your photographic techniques. Watching YouTube videos from a few years ago about your current gear may help you remember why you purchased your camera in the first place, which is neat to go back 4 or 5 years ago to the gear videos and see what they said about your camera back then. Another strategy to think about battling gas is what's your budget? How much can you spend? Is the increased cost worth the perceived benefits of the new gear? Would it be better to wait for the next model to come out? And would it be better to save your money on gear by improving your skills and taking a photo workshop instead? All right, I just shared with everybody in an email today some resources for battling gas, along with the links that Steve shared with us. Petapixel article, these are really good articles, by the way. I highly recommend you check out those links. And if you don't have any of these resources, please send me your email, drop it in the chat, and I'll make sure you get them. Okay, but these are really good resources. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful guest, Steve Miller. Steve is the equipment expert at Dan's Camera City. I highly, highly recommend before anybody buys any camera gear, they talk to Steve. From what I've understood that, and Steve can correct me if I'm wrong, the prices on camera gear are basically the same. So why not support your local camera store and talk to an expert about it in person?
You are correct, Jay. I appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely worth holding the gear in your hand rather than just looking at it on a screen. And Steve's right down the road from us. So, all right, with that, Steve, I'm going to give it over to you.
I appreciate that, Jay.
You're welcome.
All right. Can everyone see the pretty screen? It should say Berks Photo Society Gear Night.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to bring up my notes and we'll get started. So anyone that has questions, if you want to use the question and answer option by typing, that would be great. If there's something urgent that we need to cover, we'll cover it at that moment. If not, some of the links that I provided will actually cover hopefully some of the questions that I anticipate people asking. All right, I got my notes up, so we're all ready to go. So quick question, you can type this in the questions and answer section. How many people actually have a mirrorless camera currently versus a DSLR? So feel free to type. I want to try to get some participation, try to get a sense of what people are using, what people are familiar with. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is going to be, of course, new technology, as the slideshow indicates. So some of the things may be things that are new to you. Some of the things, if you have a mirrorless camera, you may have heard about, but may have not used. So hopefully this will inspire you. So let's get started. All right. So of course, this is me. I met Jay about 20 years ago. Maybe I met you at Dan's. I've been at Dan's around 20 years. Back in February of this year, Jay asked me if I'd be interested in doing a gear talk for Berks Photographic Society. Without hesitation, I said yes. I'm very excited to talk to all of you and hopefully inspire you again to do more with your camera gear that you have, or maybe consider newer gear. This, of course, is myself and my wife. I'm originally from the Poconos. I now live in the Lehigh Valley, actually in Allentown, so I'm very close to Dan's. As I mentioned, I've been at Dan's since 2004, so about 20 years. And I've been doing photography since 1996. So yes, that does mean that I did shoot with film. I've done a couple workshops with Dan's, specifically on waterfalls, birds in flight, night sky photography. And I have been a guest instructor for our Lakota wolf workshop since I photograph a lot of wildlife. So I'm going to cover what we'll talk about tonight. Again, audience participation is super helpful, so please type in questions that you may have. At the end, we'll have maybe 10 or 15 minutes to actually go over some of the questions. And again, hopefully the resources that I provide will answer some of those questions. All right. So what I'm going to talk about, of course, is newer technology and the gear and their advantages or solutions. I'm going to talk about some non-camera gear recommendations. And I'm also going to talk about some of Dan's photo workshops, some of their outings. And of course, as I mentioned at the end, we'll do some question and answer. All right. So why did I choose photography as a hobby for me? I've been doing it, like I said, since 1996. I want to express and share the creativity that I have. It makes a great gift. I'm sure all of you have probably used photography as something you could give someone, even if it was just like an 8x10 frame. Maybe a photo mug, something like that. I'm always trying to challenge myself. I want to try to create something different than I did last year, or maybe even last month. It dovetailed perfectly with my other hobbies. My wife and I are very active. We're cyclists. We backpack, we bike pack, so we camp with our bikes. We do a lot of traveling. So we want our camera to go along to capture and document life and capture those memories. Some of the other reasons I want to create concepts and express my vision. Basically, I come up with ideas in my head. They sound good. Sometimes they don't work out. Sometimes they do. But the idea is I come up with a concept and I want to see if I can then execute it in the field. I think photography is a wonderful tool for conservation. We'll cover a little bit on that in a moment. Just having beautiful photos of places that people might enjoy going to can actually help preserve land. I, of course, love to teach and share in the joy of doing. It doesn't matter if someone is a beginner or an expert, if they've been photographing for 20 years or 2 months, just helping them get to that next step and do more with their photography is very rewarding to me. So that's something I also really enjoy. So feel free to type this in the comments. What types of photography do you all enjoy? Who is currently using, again, a mirrorless camera if you didn't already type that in? These are some of the types of images that I love to take. So this is actually one of my students on the left. This is one of my favorite images because it just shows the wonderment of capturing images in the night sky. I love to shoot wildlife, of course, in the middle. I love to do silhouettes when I'm doing wildlife. And for night sky photography especially, I love to do light painting. This is an image of one of my friends. I was able to get behind her with a flashlight and do a little bit of light painting to make her stand out and kind of oppose the Milky Way. So you'll see more of these images, and we'll talk about how new technology helped me capture these types of images. I love to add a lot of mystery and intrigue. This is a portrait of my wife and I in one of our favorite places, the Pisgah National Forest of Western North Carolina. I always try to put people or animals, if possible, in the negative space of an image, sometimes lit up with a little beam of sunlight, or in this case, because we're just enough in the opening to stand out against all the blackness underneath that waterfall. This was an image that I took with my Sony A7R5 and the Tamron 17-28 in a polarizer. So this kind of gives you an idea of the types of photography that I like to do. As I mentioned, I love silhouettes. This is probably my favorite image that I've taken in the last 5 or maybe 10 years, just because of how simple it is. I love minimalist images. When I can boil something down to just a silhouette and a nice light gradient, it's wonderful. There's very little editing in this image as well. This was taken on a very foggy morning, shooting into the fog. And I was very fortunate that this animal was as close as it was to me and that it was basically in front of the sun. And I was able to be behind it. So this is something that I just get super excited about. I never get tired of, and I hope to capture many more images like this. So I mentioned about conservation. These are two images that Wildlands Conservancy actually uses to highlight why it's so important to preserve open space. This was actually my parents' neighbor's property. I was very fortunate to grow up in a rural area at the base of the Blue Mountain on the north side. This is a 500-acre parcel that, because of my photography and because I was able to show Wildlands how special a place this was, they said they would try to reach out to the landowner and see if they could preserve it. And they did just that. They bought this property in 2017, 2018, and it is now part of State Game Lines 217. And I've gone back, of course, many times since and captured more images, and they continue to use the images to help people donate money or to encourage people to donate money to preserve more land. So don't undersell your photography. It could just be, a farm or something that you see regularly, and to you it's, a nice place, but not anything special. But to someone else, it could cause them to make a future changing gift and, preserve 500 acres like this, or even, 5 or 10 acres. All right. So again, why do I love Photography New Tech so much? Like I mentioned, I want to challenge myself. I want to help challenge you guys. I want you to do more different types of photography. Saying that I always like to say is, why not try to make more challenging subject, or why not try to photograph more challenging subjects or creative photos that the new tech permits, instead of making easy photos easier. So go for something more challenging. Don't necessarily get new gear because it allows you to just make the easy photos easier. Capture better or more unique memories in fleeting moments or less than ideal conditions. If you've ever had a situation where it was too dark, too foggy, too whatever, the camera didn't cooperate. Cameras have changed a lot in the last couple of years to work better in inclement weather. We'll talk about, of course, how all of these technologies relates. There'll be a lot, like I said, of time to have questions answered. I, of course, take a lot of satisfaction when I've successfully captured my vision or I've helped someone else capture their vision. And I think it makes photography more accessible and enjoyable for all. So new technology sometimes can remove some of the stumbling blocks that may have taken people 3 or 4 or 5 years. Anyone that shot a mirrorless camera recently knows that the live preview for exposure, being able to see if your image is too bright or too dark, is super helpful. That may have taken a long time to learn when you were shooting film or even a DSLR. Now it makes it much easier to shoot in manual and be more creative. It, of course, makes photography more fun, and more of your energy can be spent on telling a story or composition, or even capturing different perspectives that would have been too challenging to do without some of this new technology. So as I go through this, type in the questions, which of these new technologies has been most rewarding to you or beneficial for your photography? So the ones that I'm going to highlight tonight are object-based tracking. Autofocus has changed a lot. It is not the same as it was 3 years ago, 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. Stabilization has changed a lot in camera. Smaller size, volume, and weight. We're carrying gear now that's half the size or a third the size in some cases of what we carried 15 or 20 years ago. Of course, better low light performance. You can never have enough light, and better dynamic range. Why not capture an image that looks more like what you see instead of a representation that might not be as good? A few more that we'll talk about: in-camera processing power, being able to see better in dark situations or in tricky lighting situations. What I mean by that is having your camera up to your eye and being able to actually see better in the dark. And of course, more customization. If you have to think about things when you're pressing buttons on your camera, you might not be familiar with it, but it also you might not be taking full advantage of the custom buttons on your camera. So we'll touch on that. All right. So object-based autofocus tracking. So who likes to photograph animals, aircraft, people, trains? With object-based autofocus tracking, it actually recognizes the silhouette or outline of those subjects. When we had contrast-based autofocus, it didn't have any idea, the autofocus, that is, whether you're pointing the camera at a tree, a fire hydrant, or a person. Now the cameras actually know what people are. They actually know what trains are. They know what airplanes are. If your subject is heavily backlit, like the subject that I showed here, autofocus tends to struggle. With object tracking, it doesn't really matter because it's a silhouette. It sees the outline or shape. This is a shot that would have been pretty tough to get in the fog, backlit, but it was actually super easy. The camera consistently kept this series of images, the elk walked through the frame and away from me in focus. This is an image that I took in Pennsylvania. It's in north central Pennsylvania, and this was taken with my Sony A7R5. So again, an image that would have been quite challenging just a few years ago was actually quite easy. So again, you can see the objects that are recognized, the camera actually knows the shape of a train. It knows what the face of the dog is, and it can focus on its eyes. If the eyes are not in focus, if the face is not in focus, the image doesn't have as much impact. If you focused on the foreground instead of the dog, that image is probably one you're going to delete. With the object tracking, the camera actually ignores the grass. And the image on the right, you can see those are kites. This was actually taken in Europe by a gentleman that I did link mirrorless comparisons. The camera knows what a bird is. It knows its silhouette. It will track that shape. It'll ignore branches. I'm sure people have had many, many times where branches were in focus and the bird wasn't. You ended up deleting the photo. So again, the camera doesn't use contrast. It ignores things like branches. It ignores things like fences, signs, etc. So this is another great example. I'll start with the image of the buck on the right. You can see all that yellow. That's actually goldenrod that's out of focus. I purposely use that as a framing device for this deer. So with object tracking, the camera has the ability to ignore those things. So you try different things than you would have normally. Once you get the safe shots out of the way, you can crouch down and incorporate things in the foreground that you wouldn't otherwise even try to do to make a more interesting image. It almost looks like the foreground was painted in to frame the animal. The silhouette image of the elk on the left, that wasn't as challenging, but again, as a silhouette, the camera had zero problems keeping the animal in focus, and it might have in the past tried to grab the brighter clouds in the background. In the DSLR days, of course, we would try to use a smaller AF array and try to go in between. So if there was, grass, you would try to put that autofocus point in between. With object tracking, it doesn't really matter where the animal is in the frame. It just finds it, and then you're free to compose as you like. So that's a huge difference in the way that you would shoot. If anyone's not sure what that means or how that sounds, certainly ask the question later. One thing that I've noticed with object tracking is it's accurate most of the time. The next slide that I'm going to show you is an example where, depending on the version or vintage, it might have some trouble with, because this is probably the most extreme example I have. So this is a bull elk in the rain in a field of white flowers. The flowers are basically taller than me, and on purpose, I crouched down when I took this photo. One of the things that's absolutely amazing every time I photograph elk is how quietly they can move when they want to. This elk came to within 40 yards of me, and because I had my back to it, I never heard it until it actually made a very unusual sound. If anyone's familiar with elk, they make what's called a glunk sound when they're chasing females. He made a glunk sound. I realized there was an elk behind me. I was able to get a couple normal photos, and then I crouched down to basically only 2 or 3 feet off the ground to shoot through as much of this flower material as possible. So it kind of looked like glowing orbs around the elk to frame him. Completely different image than you would normally get if, that wasn't there. So I thought it was super interesting. Since the flowers are all around the elk, why not have it in the foreground as well? This is a situation where, of course, a regular autofocus system would struggle really badly. The object tracking did work pretty well. If I would have had to try to focus through this, I probably wouldn't have gotten the photo with the DSLR, because in about 15 seconds, the elk took off. But of course, I get to share the photo with you because it did work. 2 more examples, very, very backlit. A lot of people, when they see the image on the left, they actually think it's the sun, or I mean the moon. It is actually the sun. It was a super foggy morning. Again, with silhouettes, it doesn't matter. Object tracking likes silhouettes just fine. It ignored those branches in the foreground and kept the elk nice and sharp. The image of the doe on the right, of course, it was snowing really hard. The camera normally doesn't like that. It struggles, but because there was enough of a silhouette or shape of the deer, it did focus on her and ignored the snow falling, ignored the grasses around her. Both images, of course, were taken with my Sony setup. This is something that hopefully gets you guys excited makes you want to try it if you don't already use this. It is actually on a bunch of cameras now from Canon and Nikon, Sony and Olympus. It's kind of funny. I see people still setting regular autofocus areas and not taking advantage of the animal tracking or the airplane tracking, or whatever they're interested in photographing. So please, if you have it on your camera, turn it on and use it. All right, we're going to go on to stabilization. Better stabilization. So the question I always like to ask people is, who really likes to use a tripod? I know in certain situations I do because it's absolutely necessary. This is a situation where this waterfall is not on any trail, and it's about 10 miles round trip to get to. I don't own a tripod that would go physically tall enough to give me this perspective that I'd be willing to carry 10 miles to get this photo. So instead, what I did is I held my camera up about 6 feet off the ground, and I used the stabilization in my camera to get a 1 second exposure so I could make the water move. This is a really, really neat place, and it was great to be able to take friends of ours there. This is actually a photo of my wife and one of our friends actually looking at mushrooms at the base of the falls. And again, without the stabilization, I just wouldn't have been able to get this photo, or I would have been pretty sore carrying, you know, a 5 or 6 pound tripod that would have gotten tall enough the 10 miles round trip to get there. This is an image taken with the Canon R7 and the 100 to 400 RF lens. The stabilization that Canon has in their mirrorless cameras is incredible. It's actually better than what I have in my more expensive Sony. This is an image that was taken at 1/4 of a second at over 600 millimeters equivalent. It's a storm rolling into the city of Allentown. I wasn't really there to take pictures of it. I was actually there to take pictures of deer, and I noticed the nice light and the downtown getting lit up. And I figured, hey, I don't have a tripod, but I might as well try taking this picture, and thankfully it turned out clear. So this is a quick visual to help you guys understand why stabilization is different if you don't know the difference. So back in the day, when you had a camera and lens, I'm going to hold up, this is actually my wife's camera. Normally stabilization could only counteract movement that was this way and this way, left, right, up and down. Now with the sensor-based stabilization, it also compensates for pitch and roll. So when you press the shutter down, the camera tends to dip a little, or it might rock forward or back. The lens-based stabilization couldn't counteract that, but the sensor-based stabilization, of course, can. So you end up getting clearer photos, and that's why you can usually get much slower shutter speeds when you have stabilization on the sensor, or better yet, on the sensor plus in the lens. They actually work together. One of the reasons a DSLR couldn't work as well, if you think about it like this, I'm going to very quickly, don't do this with your own camera, I'm going to very quickly unmount a lens. In a mirrorless camera, the light reaches the sensor very quickly. In a DSLR, because of the mirror box, the light had to get projected further back into the camera. And as a result, they didn't have much room to move the sensor around for stabilization. That's why most of the manufacturers chose not to put stabilization on the sensor in the DSLR days. And that's why now most of the manufacturers have it on their mirrorless cameras. Just a quick comparison. The image on the left is an image that I took with a mirrorless camera that has a stabilized sensor. The image on the right is an image that I took with a DSLR that only had a stabilized lens. Both images are at 1 second. Yes, of course, I could have used a tripod because this was in a brewery, Bozer Geist in Easton, but I wanted to show the difference. If you're doing street photography, sometimes it's inconvenient to take a tripod. You can see the image on the left is clear, the image on the right is not. This is another area I've really started to experiment with in the last year or two. Intentional camera movement, but still keeping something in the image sharp. If you look really close, the rider's face and eyes are sharp. Nothing else in the picture is sharp. My shutter speed was only a 15th of a second, and I'm panning very quickly because he's moving at about 20 miles an hour to match his speed. Of course, I'm using off-camera flash to help freeze his eyes, but the difference is when you pan left to right now with a stabilized sensor, the camera is able to counteract this movement, even though you're intentionally moving the camera this way. And that's a big deal because if the camera was moved too much up and down, the background would be really distracting instead of the slight movement that we see in this image. So this is something I'm super excited about. I want to do more of this type of photography. I'm so glad this photo turned out because this was actually during a paid photography assignment for a mountain bike race. This is another great example where stabilization really bailed me out. My wife and I got to this waterfall and I was like, I have to shoot the waterfall from the base. The only problem was there was no place to safely set up a tripod. The current was way too strong. Every time I tried to set up my tripod, it was ready to fall over. So of course, I'm not gonna have my gear get dumped in the water. So what I did is I took my tripod legs and collapsed them up and I balanced them on the tip of a dinner plate sized rock. So yes, I did use a tripod, but not in the way that you probably should. And I was not standing directly behind the tripod because the rock I was balancing it on was in too much of a current that I even couldn't stand behind the rock. I had to reach my arms out like this to hold the tripod and put it on self-timer. So thankfully this 1 second exposure was sharp. And again, without the stabilization, I'm pretty sure it probably wouldn't have turned out. Anyone that photographs places like Longwood Gardens, museums, they have a tripod policy. You can sometimes take a tripod in, but sometimes you can't. That's another really great reason to have a stabilized sensor and stabilized lenses because you may not need to use it anymore. All right, size and weight. So this is a saying that I think I've actually told Jay before. The best camera is the one you have with you. I'm a huge fan of making full use of what you have. Of course, I'm talking about new technology tonight, but if you have a camera that's smaller and lighter, you're more likely to take it with you. Sometimes the best camera that you have is your phone, but sometimes you want more than what your phone can give you. I picked up the Canon R10 and the 100-400 because it was a wonderful balance of size, weight, and performance. That combination is only about 2.5 pounds. And that means that it weighs about 5 pounds less than my similar Sony camera and lens set up in full frame. So I really like that I can take it with me almost anywhere, which is what I'm going to show you in the next slide. So that's my mountain bike. That's in the Tyodotin State Forest in north central Pennsylvania. And the red arrow is pointing to my camera. So when I do very long adventure rides, I'm not going to wear a backpack because it's just going to be uncomfortable to ride for long distances like 50 or 60 miles with a camera on my back. So it stays in that waterproof bag on my fork. I made some high density foam to kind of pad the camera. And that allows me to take that Canon with that lens along for a ride like this that we're going to stay overnight and give me better photos than I would have been able to get with my phone. The reason that I wanted to take my camera for this particular ride is the area we were going has a lot of black bears. It has a lot of river otters. It has a lot of bald eagles. If I saw any one of those and I tried to get a picture with my phone, I'd be pretty disappointed that I went all that way and didn't come home with a good photo. This was the final destination after we rode for about 7 hours that day. We ended up on the highest point in Tioga County on top of a mountain, and that was the view from our campsite. So we unpacked all of our gear and I went out and took some photos just to kind of document the campsite. The route that we took was almost 4,000 feet of elevation change. So I really, like I said, didn't want to carry the weight of my heavier Sony setup. I, of course, had camping gear and food and water for 2 days. So every ounce counted. And I was able to get a really cool photo of my buddy at this vista the next morning. So it really made it worthwhile to bring my camera along. Like I said, being able to have a smaller and lighter camera has given me less excuses to take my camera along to places like this. So this is the photo that I was able to take the following morning, enjoying the view from our campsite with the fog in the valleys. My buddy had never been to this place. I had been once before, so I was super excited to show it to him and get a great photo of him. I think this is actually a photo that is now in his house. His girlfriend really liked it. And I was very thankful again that I could take my camera along to capture something like this. The Tamron 17 to 28 2.8 is one of my favorite full frame lenses for travel. It's a tiny lens. It's, about 3 inches long. It weighs right around a pound. It's actually the same as some of the Micro Four Thirds 2.8 lenses for wide angle, and certainly the same size or smaller than some of the APS-C wide angle lenses, which is crazy because it's a full frame lens. It goes with me almost exclusively when we photograph waterfalls because it's weather sealed. And I also use it for night sky photography. And I just love the size and weight. This is an image taken with that lens on a backpacking trip. Anyone that wants to go to a place in Pennsylvania where you don't see any people, check out the Quihana Wild Area. This was in the Quihana Wild Area. It's an area that is very large, and the closest town is about 20 miles away. On this particular trip, we did not see anyone until we got back on the paved roads. The blueberries in fall are absolutely stunning. This image is actually the real color that those foreground blueberries get. They actually oftentimes are more vibrant than the sunsets or sunrises. And it's one of the reasons that I chose this campsite, because I knew that there's a good chance of being able to put them in the foreground and make a really cool image. And of course, this was with that 17 to 28 lens. I can't forget, of course, the OG of small and light, Olympus, now OM Digital Solutions. As I mentioned, I have familiarity with Olympus. I used to own an Olympus EM5 Mark II and the 9 to 18 lens. This is one of those images that Wildlands used for their conservation efforts to show that property they preserved. I used a polarizer. This was at sunrise, right from a campsite off of the Appalachian Trail. Sony makes a wonderful 11 millimeter APS-C lens. This lens is tiny. If you look at the woman's fingers holding it, you can see it's, only about 2.5 inches long. It weighs the same as 2 DSLR or mirrorless camera batteries. It's a great lens. The image of the gentleman on the mountain bike was just on a whim. I was testing the lens out and I could hear him coming, so I was able to grab a quick photo of him. And what's unique about this lens, besides it being very tiny and light, it uses 2 magnet-based motors called linear motors, which means it focuses extremely fast. This lens actually focuses faster than most of the 16 to 35 or 14 to 24 full frame pro grade DSLR lenses. So when you press the button down, the focus is pretty much instantaneous because it uses magnets. There's no gears. So if you've never tried a magnet-based motor, it's pretty amazing. But certainly the size and weight, I'm willing to take it with me almost everywhere. Low light performance. This has completely changed the way that I shoot. I used to use a star guider pretty often to do night sky photography. Now with being able to shoot at 6400 or 12,800, I very rarely do, because this is a single raw exposure at ISO 6400. So there's not really a reason if I'm backpacking to take a star guider with me anymore, because that image is certainly more than good enough. If I was going to do deep space objects, yes, of course, I would still use my star guider. But if I'm doing wide angle astro landscapes, there's not really a need anymore. The full frame sensors from Sony and Nikon that are backside illuminated currently are the best in the industry, because not only do they have a lot of light gathering potential, but the files that they capture have an amazing ability to edit, especially the shadows and midtones. Even though this is a high ISO image, you can still lighten it 1 to 2 stops with very little detriment to the quality of the color and detail. If you pair that technology now with things like Topaz, you might be able to get a 24 by 36 from ISO 6400, 12,800, or even 25,600 on some of the modern cameras, assuming you correctly expose. These are 2 more examples showcasing dynamic range. So the image on the left is a 20 by 30 metal print in our kitchen. That was ISO 6400 from Yellowstone National Park. That is not a stacked image. That is not a guided image. It's an 8-second exposure with a 24-1.4. The image on the right is a picture of my wife taking Comet Neowise. That's at ISO 25,600. That is not guided. That was a 3-second exposure that I then lightened a little bit more. A funny story that I tell about the Yellowstone image, that was in an area that was only a mile or so from an active grizzly bear area. So you weren't supposed to enter the active grizzly bear area. Obviously, I was about a mile away. I joked with my wife, hopefully bears can read. She said, I'm not getting out of the car. I had to go by myself. Thankfully, it was only about 500 feet from where we parked, and I was able to come home with that image. And I did not see any bears. One more low light image. This is at 12,800 ISO. There's no way this long ago or 5 years ago that I would have been able to make an image this clean with this good of color. The image pretty much is the same color as what I saw in that moment. So it's not muted. It doesn't have any funky like browns or magentas. It's pretty much what I saw. This was only a 30th of a second at f6.3. So it was very dark. The image is much brighter than what my eyes saw. The elk was almost a silhouette to my eyes. And of course, this is another Pennsylvania elk. Here's a great example of dynamic range. I didn't have time to react. My buddy was taking pictures of me, and I went to get a picture of him up on this rock. So I was probably 2 to 3 stops overexposed. The clouds in the sky were completely blown out. He was a good exposure, but I thought, man, I really would have liked to have captured the sky the way I saw it. Thankfully, the image was recoverable. I was able to recover almost 3 stops in the highlights, and there is still detail in those clouds. And it ended up being a really neat image that was fun instead of like a staged image that I took later. If you don't like shooting and processing RAW, we are going to talk about a little bit of in-camera processing that can help with that. So I understand not everyone likes RAW. I absolutely love RAW, but certainly the next couple slides that we're going to talk about after my last low light dynamic range image might be of your interest. This is actually 2 images. One my wife took. This is an image. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, do you see all the blackness? Her RAW file was 4 stops underexposed. We weren't planning to see moose. We were actually shooting sunset in northern Vermont, and she still had her camera set for sunset. The moose crossed the road. It was on her side of the car. She was able to get a couple images of it. She showed me the back of her camera and it was black. I said to her, please do not delete that image. She had no idea at that time that that much data could be recovered. That image that you see on the screen is, of course, after we lightened it, and it looks totally fine. Having the ability to basically take my wife from almost crying to, wow, this is a really good image I got of a moose, and it was actually her first moose image, and make her really happy was a great moment. There's very little like noise or color shifts or anything, so it was really cool to be able to see that. Of course, the last image here. This is a very high contrast scene. The elk was almost silhouetted. I chose to make my exposure so that the pink to the right of his butt was just about clipped, but not quite. You can see there's pretty much a full range of the tones in the cotton candy skies. And I was able to lift all the detail in the shadow to see the animal as my eyes saw it. As a JPEG, this wouldn't have been possible. Newer sensors like Canon's R8, their R6 Mark II, the R5, are completely capable of giving an image like this. Nikon sensors are as well. Olympus, their OM1, is able to do this. Some of the older cameras, like a 5D or a 6D or a 1D series, or the EOS RP, would have a little bit more trouble with a shot like this. There are still differences at this juncture in 2023 in sensor tech, but thankfully most of the cameras now can give you an image with this much dynamic range. Now we're going to talk about in-camera processing. This is a subject that not everyone's probably going to like because it's a copperhead. You can see on the image on the left, the copperhead's body is completely out of focus. The image on the right, pretty much everything's in focus. Canon and Olympus have amazing in-camera focus stacking. It works wonderfully where it captures a bunch of images, composites them in camera, and you get an image that's much, much greater depth of field. And one thing that comes up pretty consistently is, well, why not just shoot like f/22? Wouldn't f/22 give you enough depth of field? The problem with doing that is diffraction. If you shoot f/22, the image will actually be softer. Yes, you might get more depth of field. You wouldn't get enough in this particular example, but the image would be soft. Instead, I was able to use the sweet spot on my lens, which is f8. And I was able to still get more than enough depth of field because, of course, the camera was able to take 2 to 3 inches of depth by stacking a bunch of images. Canon and Olympus have this in almost every model that they make, except for like the R100, and of course some of the older DSLRs. I think in Olympus's line, it's an even greater amount of cameras. I think maybe only the EM10 Mark IV is the only model that may not have it. Any Olympus shooters can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. This is an image from Val. I have to give kudos and thanks to Val for capturing such an amazing image. This is Olympus's live composite technology. So the concept is you set a base exposure, in this case for the concrete structure and the sand. And because the stars are moving, they're added as multiple exposures over a period of maybe an hour, maybe an hour and a half, maybe as little as 45 minutes. So it allows the camera to have much better noise performance, better color, better detail. And it's a really great way to not have to use camera editing software on the computer to get an image that's pretty close to ready to go. And you certainly don't have to combine up multiple images by stacking. So one of my favorite technologies, and it's actually something, as far as I know, is only available on OM Digital Solutions camera, formerly Olympus. So seeing in the dark. Most people that have used a mirrorless camera understand that what you see is what you get on the viewfinder. But did you know that you can program a button? In this case, on my camera, if I program the right, or if I push the right button, it'll actually gain the viewfinder up so I can see in the dark. This is a huge aid to being able to see and compose in low lit situations, whether it's a night sky image like this, a cityscape, a dark wedding venue. I can basically compose, press the button again, see the exposure, and then take the picture. This is also super helpful if you're in a studio and you're a flash shooter. You can disable the flash preview, which is usually black because, of course, the flash hasn't fired. So that way you can see what the ambient light's going to look like in the background behind your subject. Here's an example of a portrait with a full moon actually in the background. This was an image where I could basically dial in the exact exposure I wanted on the couple and the moon. And in my flash above them that was up on a light stand, added a little kiss of light to make them pop out. And I could see, their faces a little bit better. Being able to see that exposure and have the confidence that it was exactly the way I wanted was super helpful. And I could just toggle back and forth on those buttons. All right, custom buttons. As I mentioned earlier, if you're struggling to get to things quickly or you're going into a menu, you're probably not taking full advantage of your custom buttons. You may not have to go to the extreme of the diagram that I show here, but if you want to, you can. Basically, everything that I would normally change in a menu, I have a custom button for. On my particular camera, I'm just going to go over a couple. I'm not going to bore you with all of them. The trash can turns on silent shooting. So if I'm doing wildlife and I don't want the camera to make noise, I can press the trash can. I have dual back button focusing. The leftmost button closest to my viewfinder runs a larger AF area that covers almost the whole frame. The image on the right runs a very small, precise area. That gives me the ability to, when the object tracking doesn't work, to shoot in between branches without having to go into the menu and change the autofocus mode. I literally just move my thumb. I can't tell you how many times that's bailed me out and I've gotten shots that I would have otherwise not been able to get if I had to go in the menu. If you want to know more of the custom buttons that I set, certainly type some questions, shoot me an email, but there's a lot of potential as to what you can set. This is an example where object tracking normally would work, but if it doesn't work, I can quickly hit that small array on the AEL button and kind of go in between whatever the foliage may be using that small, precise, flexible spot. Again, the object tracking varies camera to camera, and if it doesn't work as well on your camera, it's nice to have a backup that you can use regular focus arrays. It's really cool kind of having the best of both worlds. I have a big wide area that tracks faster, and I have a smaller, slower, more precise area when I need it. Hopefully you guys are using your C1, C2, C3, or in the case of OM C4, they have the most. In my case, when I shoot with manual Laowa lenses, I showed some photos already. I'm going to show some more. The C1 setting tells my camera a whole bunch of things without me having to tell it. It tells the camera the focal length to run the IBIS according to the focal length. So it's an 11 millimeter. If you don't tell your camera that you have an 11 millimeter or a 50 millimeter or whatever the case may be, it's going to stabilize incorrectly, which means it's not going to work as well. It's going to turn on things like focus magnification and focus peaking. It's going to set my shutter speed to 1/4 of a second, because most of the time when I use that lens, guess what I'm doing? Waterfalls. So just by turning the dial to C1, in an instant, I'm ready to shoot a waterfall, and then I can go back to a normal lens without having to reset anything by going back to manual or aperture or whatever I'm shooting. I use C2 to do quick portraits, 2.8, ISO 100, relatively high shutter speed, and I use C3 to use a manual lens with flash for macro. And that has its own parameters of settings based on IBIS, shutter speed, etc. And again, it's just a way to save time and make it easier to shoot a variety of different subjects. This is an image that I showed earlier and a new image. Both of those were with that manual lens using the C1 setting, the Laowa 11 millimeter in this case. Having the ability to quickly punch in and have focus peaking and focus magnifier available is super helpful. I wanted to ensure that the foreground on the left image, which was the leaves, was sharp, and I had enough depth of field to cover all the way to the back of the waterfall. Focus peaking told me that right away, so I didn't really have to guess. Non-camera gear recommendations. Hey, I'm going to talk about stuff you don't have to buy. Imagine that. So create a photography goal list. It's fun to have goals that you can aim towards or try to improve towards. I'm going to give you a couple examples of some of my goal lists. I want to capture an image with a longer focal length, like an 85 millimeter, of someone standing on a rocky outcrop. I have some specific places in the Sproul State Forest of Pennsylvania where I've already researched. I know they'll work. It's just been cloudy. And I want to try to capture an image similar to that where someone's on some rocks with Milky Way in the background. I want to capture an image of a bull elk with the rising full moon in the background. I already have spots planned out. It's in my PhotoPills app, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But again, the weather hasn't cooperated yet. But these are things that are in my goal list, and they're things that I can work towards. I've already captured some Milky Way images with people in, but I want to continue to refine that image and make it better. I'm hoping that all of you guys have some photo goal lists as well for some dream shots. Being able to stay comfortable makes you a better wildlife photographer. If you can sit still and be patient, you will see more animals. If you're uncomfortable and you have to leave early, you are not going to see as many things. If I'm not using this particular seat, I have a small insulated pad, it's about this big, that I can sit on and get closer to the ground if I don't want to have as big of a profile when I'm in the woods. Having that has saved me so many times from having my legs fall asleep or my butt to get cold or whatever the case may be. So if you don't already have one of these, I would highly recommend getting something that you can sit on when you're in the woods. Find a place you can get to quickly and easily. When you can get to a place quickly and easily, it removes the excuse of, oh, I don't have enough time. If you have to drive a half an hour or 45 minutes to get to a spot, you're less likely to go. You're going to give the excuse, I don't have enough time. This is a spot that's only 2 blocks from my home. It's a meadow that's owned by Wildlands Conservancy. And it's actually where I do a lot of the wildlife photography. The image of the buck that I showed earlier in my presentation was taken 2 blocks from my house. Because I'm familiar with that spot, I know roughly how the light's going to be. I know roughly where the animals are going to come from. This same concept applies for street photography. If you have a cool spot a couple blocks from your house or even a short drive, you're going to be more familiar with it and likely able to make better images. Trail cameras. This is something that you might have to spend money on if you don't have one, if you're interested in wildlife photography. So trail cams are like a permanent extra set of eyes for nature photographers. If you've ever asked yourself when you should arrive to a particular place, or what does the light look like at a particular time of day if you can't normally be there, a trail camera will show you that. It'll show you what animals are in the area that you plan to photograph. It'll show you how frequently they're there. If an animal only shows up to a particular place once a month, that's a pretty big roll of the dice. If it shows up 3 or 4 times a week and it's consistent, like 5 p.m. this time of year, that's a really good feeling knowing this animal comes to this place 3 or 4 times a week around 5 p.m. Guess where I'm going to be at 5 p.m. or actually 4 p.m. I'll be waiting. Photo pills. Hopefully you guys have used photo pills. I think photo pills is absolutely amazing. It's a tool to plan night sky images, sunset, sunrise images. It even has an exposure calculator. The Milky Way image that I show from the Yellowstone area, you can see the planner image from the daytime. I screenshotted it. It told me if I went back to that spot at 9:45 at night, there would be a good chance the Milky Way would line up perfectly with this narrow opening, and it did. So that was a huge confidence booster to know that I could plan that shot out and I had a time to aim for. Scuba neoprene, you're probably like, what on earth? So you'll notice on my wife's lens, on the lens hood, and if I had my 200 to 600 here, my big lens, we actually wrap our lenses in scuba neoprene. It's a little bit thicker than the camo that you can purchase for around $100 to wrap your lenses in. So it's offering more protection. And as you can see in the price, it's about $10 or $11 to do 6 or 7 lenses worth of lens wraps. So you can save a tremendous amount of money to make by making your own. You can actually sew it or use hot glue. It takes all of about 5 minutes to make a lens wrap with scuba neoprene. And I've had one on my camera for about 3 years, so they last a long time. This is actually my 200 to 600. You can see it's wrapped up pretty nice. I actually make it bigger than what's necessary so it overlaps, so there's less likely to have dirt get in where the lens hood attaches, where the focus and zoom rings are. I'm going to talk a little bit about Dan's. I really appreciate Jay giving us such kind words. One of the things I'm most proud about with my fellow staff is they're all experts in the gear. All of our staff have used equipment in the field. They've used all the different brands, so they're not going to just say, you should buy Nikon or you should buy Sony. They're going to be able to help you best for what you want to do, not necessarily whatever might be the highest price, because they don't work on commission. One of my responsibilities at Dan's is to be familiar with all the gear so that I can make sure that all of our staff are familiar with the gear. So if I'm not there, any of our staff can help you. You can just stop in, they'll all be able to give you a hand. And you don't even have to buy anything. You can just go in and say, hey, I was thinking about this lens, or I was thinking about this filter, and they can help you out. Our workshops are really fun if you've never gotten a chance to join one of them. The image on the previous slide was from our Hickory Run Night Sky workshop. That was me and one of my coworkers, Phil. The image on the left is from Conowingo Dam. It's a bald eagle, of course. It's a wonderful place to photograph bald eagles if you've never been there. There's sometimes as many as 30 to 50 bald eagles there. The image on the right is from Lakota Wolf Preserve. The people at Lakota are wonderful. They're all volunteer except for the owner. It's a husband and wife, and they do a great job at helping photographers get better images. They're actually throwing little bits of deer meat. In this case, the deer meat went into the pond in the foreground. The wolf went down to pick it up, and then the droplets, of course, are running down his face because he just dunked his head in the water, making for a really unique image. I would highly recommend going to Lakota either as part of our class or on your own. This is another image from Lakota. Another great example of how the volunteers can help you out. They threw a little bit of deer meat in the end of this hollow log. Of course, the bobcat was more than happy to scoop it up, get a snack, and it made for an awesome photo that even though I photographed bobcats in the wild, I will probably never, ever get an image like this in the wild. This is our photo pills class. So if you ever want to learn more about photo pills, this class is coming up later this month. It's only 25 bucks. It's very, very affordable. The app's $10 to download. We don't make any money if you download the app. We only make money if you take our class. We can actually give you some hands-on on how to use the app. And we have a lot of really great examples of the power of using photo pills. The image in the bottom right-hand corner is actually a planner image from Hickory Run Sand Spring Lake, where we do our night sky workshop. and it shows where the Milky Way will be in relation to the lake, which I think is super cool. Did you know we have a Dan's blog? A lot of people have no idea we have a blog. It's a lot of free information. We've taken a lot of time to put resources together to help people get better pictures. We realize that we can't be open all the time. People want inspiration, people want places to go. So our blog actually covers a lot of really good places to go. Everything from fall foliage to waterfalls. We wrote an article in the spring on photographing the Aurora Borealis. Yes, you can do that here in Pennsylvania. People actually just photographed it on Sunday morning here in Pennsylvania. We go over a lot of great places to photograph the Milky Way. So we give you specific spots. You can go in public land where it's legal to go. You're not trespassing and you can get some great images. And of course, I had to write an article on the elk. You know that by now I love photographing elk. I give some great places to go. I give some great places to go during the day when the elk are less active. So that way you can fill your entire day and not sleep a lot. It's good times. And photograph the elk early morning and late evenings. It's only about 3 hours from Allentown or Reading as well, which is surprising to a lot of people. They don't realize that we have elk this close to this part of Pennsylvania. Here's my contact info before we get into some questions and answers. Feel free to email me, like I said. You can follow me on Instagram if you want to see more of our adventures. My wife and I post a lot of our pictures on there. We try to do, again, a lot of our north central, northeastern part of the state. I'm going to open it up to questions and answers, but before I do that, I'm going to actually swap my battery in my camera because I notice I'm at 4%. So if I blip out for a second, that's what I'm doing, and then we'll go to questions and answers.
Get your questions ready, everybody.
All right, I'm back. Can everyone still see my screen?
Yes.
All right, and obviously you can hear me. Perfect. So I really appreciate you guys joining me. I know I covered a ton of stuff, so I'm hoping that anything you had questions on, you can open up and certainly ask, and I will try to answer all the questions. I really appreciate you sitting through 63 slides of new technology.
That was fantastic, Steve. You might want to stop sharing.
There we go. Perfect.
Gary had a question. What was the mini lens that you mentioned?
Which mount was it for? I mentioned a couple mini lenses.
Okay. Gary, you have to chip in here. He said there was he was wondering what the magnetic one?
The one, it was me who asked the question, I think, actually.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
Gary did too. I asked it up there earlier. It was one that was magnet based and it was a woman's fingers holding it very tiny.
Oh yeah, that's the Sony 11mm 1.8. So it's a lens like about yay big. It's the equivalent of a 16.5mm full frame, and it's a 1.8 f-stop. It's tiny. It's a lens. As soon as I saw it, I was like, I want to get this lens because it'll travel with me. It weighs the same as basically 2 of these batteries. It's about $550.
And it's for the Sony system.
Yeah, Sony E-mount.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you. What other questions?
How is the OM1 with object tracking, Steve? Like specifically dogs. Have you tried it out?
I have. It is quite good.
Okay.
The OM1 has some really unique technology in its price point. Because it's a camera that doesn't need to use its mechanical shutter, that automatically plays up or makes the autofocus work better. If that doesn't make sense, I'll explain. So every time you take a picture and your shutter curtain goes up and down, it blocks the image sensor. If you have a camera that doesn't need to have a mechanical shutter go up and down, the autofocus can track the entire time. So the OM1's tracking is basically on par with Sony's A9 II, Nikon Z8, Canon's R3. Like, it's a very, very capable autofocus camera. The object tracking works very well.
Val agrees with you. She just said it's fantastic. Rick has a question. What's your recommendation for a good quality sling bag?
I will make a couple recommendations based on size. If your goal is to house like a small mirrorless setup, the Mindshift sling, their 10 liter or 13 liter is excellent. If you want to hold a little bit larger camera setup, like my wife's camera, something like the Peak Design, it's a little bit bigger sling. I want to say it's in like the 15 to 18 liter. It really comes down to how much gear you got to hold, because sling bags range from 6 liters up to 18 liters. 6 liters would be like an Olympus with like a pancake lens. I'm actually going through all the questions on the right here, so I'm getting caught up with you guys. What other questions do you have?
What was the name of that wild area? You said it's very secluded. Did you say Kiana?
Quehanna, Quehanna.
Okay. Because I've been to Tioga County. Is that in northern Tioga?
No. Quehanna is in Clearfield, Cameron,
Okay.
Clinton, and there might be a little bit of it in like extreme southeastern Elk County.
Okay.
It's an hour and 25 minutes northwest of State College.
Gotcha.
So I'm glad to see that people really appreciate the stabilization and the smaller size and weight as well, because that certainly has made me able to take gear a lot more of the time.
Is the Tamron 17 to 28 you mentioned, that's really small 2.8 lens. How does that, I mean, that's full frame, right?
Yeah, the 17 to 28 is a full frame 2.8 lens.
So you put that on a camera. Is it comparable in weight, would you say, to the OM1?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. The OM1 camera and like say an A7C. The A7C full frame actually weighs less than the OM1 by a little bit, not a lot. A lot of people are going to prefer the ergonomics of the OM1 though, because it actually is a bigger camera. Like, there is a point where the human hand doesn't get any smaller unless you have really small hands. Sometimes cameras can become too small. The advantage that the Olympus is going to have, especially, is mid-range to telephoto lenses tend to be smaller. Your wide angles and your primes, some of them are smaller. And without getting into a long debate, when you work with equivalent f-stops or similar f-stops, there's not as much of a savings in Micro Four Thirds for wide angle or prime lenses. It's mostly in the mid-range to telephoto.
Someone at the Goggle Works is asking about weather sealing. Can you talk more on weather sealing?
Yeah, sure. Every camera from every manufacturer at this point has some form of weather sealing. It's how far do they take it? The Sony cameras up until very recently did not have great weather sealing. In fact, only 2 generations ago, the bottom of the camera, the only sealing was how tightly the metal was screwed together. There was no rubber gasket, which was crazy because, of course, Olympus, Canon, other companies had really great sealing even 5 to 7 years ago. Now, most of the companies, you can shoot their camera in the rain or snow. And in the case of Olympus and Pentax, they even are splash resistant. So they take their sealing a little bit further, that if you wish to get splashed by a wave, the camera is more likely to survive than it would if you had another brand of camera. But I can definitely tell you from experience, I've shot extensively in the pouring rain. I've shot a lot in the snow. I've shot under waterfall spray with no ill effects on the current generation of Sony, Nikon, and Canon.
You mentioned your workshops. It would be awesome to me anyhow if Dan's and or you would consider some kind of a hiking and photography workshop, or maybe even a bike packing and photography workshop. If you could get it, that would be awesome.
I'm all for it, and honestly, our state is unbelievably friendly for that type of thing. We have more than 2 million acres of public land in Pennsylvania, and any of our state forests are either free or very low cost to camp. You can basically use an online permit system. So if you know you plan to be in a given area, you can request a permit for that area, and you can ride your bike to some amazing places. That ride that we did up in the Pine Creek where I took the Canon, we passed, I want to say 25 waterfalls. And we saw probably 10 or 15 different vistas. It was super fun to be able to do. And of course, the night sky is amazing in those types of places.
If anybody has any questions directly for Steve, just unmute and speak up. Now's your chance to ask an expert on equipment if you have any questions on anything.
Yeah, and if not, I'll go through a couple of the questions that were already asked that we didn't address yet.
Sure, go ahead.
So Jenny Lodge asked, do you have to set a special focus point for object tracking? So that's the whole benefit of object tracking, is you don't use any focus points. The animal recognizes, like if I said to person, it recognizes the shape of my face. It recognizes the shape of my torso. If I turn away from the camera still recognizes the shape of the back of my head. So I just turn it on human or animal or airplane or train, and it just recognizes the shape. So there's no focus points needed. It's a very different way of shooting. You're not really aiming anymore. If the subject is in the frame, it finds it.
So I was want to ask the question. So you set that somewhere in the menu. Do you have a button set for that so you can tell it where you want to pick bird, person, whatever it is?
Yeah, usually it's in the menu. What camera do you have?
Well, I have an older OM Olympus EM10 Mark
Okay, yeah.
IV.
So I believe the EM5 has a more basic version, the Mark III, and then the OM1 has basically one of the best versions of object tracking.
Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking. That was a good question.
Steve, I have a question that I've often wondered about. The iPhone, as you know, is getting better and better and better and better.
It's amazing.
And is that because sensor technology, is that continuing to double, triple? And I mean, every couple of years it's getting better and better. Is that kind of like what's going on? Are sensors just getting better and better?
It's actually really interesting. I'm glad you asked that question, because this is something we covered in 2021 with our staff, and we covered again in the spring of this year. Not only is sensor technology getting better, but the big advantage that smartphones have is they're able to combine many images. So if you combine a bunch of images, you can gather more light. If you can do it really quickly that people don't have to wait, they're not going to mind. So the night mode on most smartphones combines a bunch of images. It gets rid of the noise and gives you better color and detail. When you do a portrait image, instantaneously the camera focuses on the person, and then it focuses on the background. It says, well, clearly that stuff's not important. I'm going to use AI to blur it out, because it doesn't have the f-stop necessary to make a blurry background, but through software, it can do it pretty darn instantaneously. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, are cameras doing the same thing?
Well, it's kind of funny you mentioned that too. OM Digital Solutions is. So some of the night modes, like live composite, was a technology that was actually started with, I want to say, Google Pixel, or maybe Phase One. I'm trying to remember now the brand, but that idea of making a base exposure and then adding to it is a brilliant idea to get more out of a smaller sensor. Things like the high res mode is another concept. Being able to take that small sensor and move it around and get a super high resolution that's as detailed or more detailed than a full frame image is amazing. Why not make it do more? Like, I love that OM has been more creative to do that, because it gives you, you know, a camera system that's smaller and lighter, and you kind of get both. And it's only getting faster. Like, it's taking less time to do all this processing, because originally you couldn't shoot handheld and now you can for high res mode. What other questions?
Well, I brought up that question because, 30, 40 years ago, whatever, in the film days, there were clear distinctions between format quality. 8x10 film, 4x5, medium format down to 35 millimeter, you could tell the difference in quality. And that's still present today to some extent, right? But it's blurred more. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So now it's things like subject isolation out of camera, if you care about that. Like, if I put a really fast, like a 1.2 or 1.4 lens in a full frame, I'm going to get more subject isolation out of camera on a full frame than I would on an APS-C or on a Micro Four Thirds. But again, with software, if I choose to make the background blurrier, I can. And it may be at a certain point where you could get diminished returns. Like, do you want to carry a $2,000 or $3,000 lens that's bigger and heavier to get that look? Whereas, the Olympus 45-1.8 is a tiny little lens and does a pretty nice job for portraits. Like, you may not even need that extra background blur. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Rick has questions. One is, does the Nikon Z series have object tracking? And what else did he ask? The Z8 or the Z9? Question mark.
Yeah, so the Z series from Nikon, the Z8 and Z9 have excellent object tracking. All of their other mirrorless cameras have a form of it, but it's pretty basic. So the way that it works on the cameras that are not the Z8 and Z9, it'll recognize my face, it'll recognize a dog, it'll recognize a deer. If the person, dog, deer, whatever the subject is, turns away from the camera, it might lose it. The early object tracking wasn't great if the animal or person wasn't looking at the camera. The Z8 and Z9, they don't care. If the subject looks away from the camera, it says, okay, well, clearly I know this animal has a torso. I'll go to the animal's torso until the face becomes available again. So that's one of the reasons that the Z8 and Z9 are a little bit of a premium. They have a much more sophisticated autofocus tracking. The new ZF actually has better autofocus than the Z6 and Z7, mostly because it's newer and it could borrow from the Z8 and Z9. That's the retro mirrorless camera that they just announced like a month or so ago.
Bob, does anybody in the Goggle Works have questions?
They had a question about hours that I can cover as well.
Go ahead.
So Dan's is open Tuesday through Friday, 10 until 6. Saturday, 10 until 4. Closed Sundays and Mondays.
I don't think we have any other questions here. That was the most important question. Your hours. Because
Perfect.
now everybody's drooling over the new technology here.
Thank you.
Marshall has something. Marshall has a question.
Okay, Steve, this is Marshall at the Goggle Works. And
Marshall.
hi, how you doing there? It's been
Great.
very informative. Now I'm kind of drooling, that's for sure. But one of the things I know they've been advertising a lot with the Google Pixel camera, and they show a whole bunch of things where people are looking the wrong way or it's not good, and how they go ahead and have a whole series of pictures.
That's right.
And they pick out the ones that are the best and make a perfect picture that way. Now, is this something that all of the iPhones and cameras like that are going to get onto it, or is that strictly proprietary with Google?
I don't think it's going to be proprietary forever. Google has been a trendsetter where new technology tends to debut on their phones. I've never heard of this technology up until about 2 or 3 months ago. So I expect maybe in a year or 2 years, the other brands may have some version of it. But right now, I think it is only in Google phones.
It seems like that's the thing that they are really pushing. I mean, if you're not taking a lot of pictures of people, I think that probably the other phones are as good, if not better.
Yeah, the big advantage that the Google phones have always had is they give you a lot of customization, like as a camera. They were one of the first to let you shoot RAW in a phone. Now that's much more common. So yeah, I think again, the best camera is the one that you have with you. So that if that's an iPhone 7 or, whatever from 5 or 10 years ago, use what you have, unless there's some reason to, take advantage of that new technology, just like what I showed tonight.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Does Dan send you to, occasionally, do they send you to the big camera equipment expos in New York City or anything like that? Because that might be a neat field trip Dan could have with people too. Let's go up to the big photo expo wherever,
Yeah, so I've personally done a large dealer trade show that actually happens in Florida, but it's not the same as like the ones that happen at like the Javits Center. It's actually for pro dealers.
Okay.
Nikon, Canon, Olympus, OM, Sony are there, but it's not the ones that most people think of because it is more of just a dealer. It's not open to like consumers. And yes, it is a lot of fun. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Do you end up drooling yet? Or
Yeah. I actually have a couple things that I have seen in the last year that I really, really appreciate. Nikon has an absolutely incredible 600 millimeter Z lens. It's about this big and it weighs 3 pounds. So it is as light as Olympus's 300 f4, but yet it's a full frame lens. It just boggles my mind. I want so badly for Sony to make a lens like that. Part of the reason that I shoot Canon, Nikon, and Sony is, of course, so I can be familiar with all the gear to help all of our customers and staff. But then also I can kind of pick and choose the best parts of each brand, because right now they don't have all of it. I love the focus stacking in my Canon. I love the small size. I love, of course, the image quality of my Sony. I love some of the Nikon telephotos. So who knows? Maybe at some point I'll get that super lightweight Nikon lens.
anybody else have any questions before we let Steve go? Now's the time to speak up, everybody. All righty.
Yeah, and
Well,
if not, go ahead, Jay.
I'm gonna go ahead and end the recording now.
Thank you.
Thank you.